Hello, and welcome back to our series of studies on the great 19th century philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, who lived in Denmark between 1813 and 1855. And this series of studies, it's number 18, I believe, right, producer? Uh, yeah, he says it's 18, the 18th study, so we've gone a long way. And each of these studies lasts 30 minutes because that's really the limit of my bandwidth that I can load up to YouTube. And all the studies so far are on YouTube. And you can access any studies you've missed by going to my Facebook page. Just go to facebook.com and do a search under my name, Ross M. Bond, Bagne. Bond is a French word. If you don't know what it means, read the novel Papillon, and then you'll know what it means. But that's a different subject. I won't go into that right now. But anyway, we're going to pick up, I think, right now on page 169. And we're really in the analysis of the subjective thinker in the magnum opus of SK's aesthetic and philosophical works. And it's well worth reading. If you don't have a copy of my book, I wish you would buy one. You can get it on Amazon.com. Just put in my name, and it's going right now for $19.99. Or you can email me at ross, at ynet.net. I sell it for $16 and no handling. But just if you want a copy, you can go ahead and contact me. So we're looking at the relationship between the objective thinker and the subjective thinker. And where we, excuse me, where we left off was on page 168. And the relationship between objective reality and the subjective reality in terms of the thinking of both thinkers, the objective thinker and the subjective thinker. The world historical is quite simply subject to the dialectics of the accidental, both into an assiduous study of history and in the attempt to acquire world historical significance, where the mere winds of fate determine one's destiny. And we see that, of course, in anyone who tries to earn or achieve fame and fortune in the world, and the pangs that it brings that person, if that's what he establishes as his telos, his ultimate goal to be famous, to be rich, and it brings many sufferings into one's life if that's your God, that is your purpose in life. The subjective thinker, on the other hand, is a Christian thinker, hopefully, and he sees that the real purpose of life, the real objective, is to become, to achieve his subjective self, to achieve what God wants him to be subjectively as a human being, to be his God-given self. And we're going to get into a lot of that in Sickness Unto Death. And we're just touching on that right now. Whether in the objective world, the fortunes of time uh, and the ways that time and fate interact, whether the example of the actions of a king are more important than the actions of the lowliest advisor is anyone's guess. I mean, this is the flakiness, the craziness of the empirical world of existence that so many people put their reliance on. whether in the empirical world the king is more important than his lowliest advisor, is the court lackey, the jester, court jester, whatever you want to call him. Whichever is important is totally up to fate. God knows. No man knows. However much I want to be famous, um, it's subject to the whims of fate, the whims of fortune. The the attempt to become world historical or famous or rich is also subject to the whims of chance and fate. This anyone can easily discern for himself, and it doesn't take a philosopher to tell us how so many people who wanted to be great ended up as failures, and people who didn't care and ended up as great successes. It's the whims of fate in the empirical world that produce these things. But the subjective thinker has another uh, telos in mind. And SK describes it this way: a truly great ethical personality would seek to realize his life in the following manner. He would strive to develop himself with the utmost exertion of his powers. In so doing, he would perhaps produce great effects on the eternal world. But this external result is not in his power, and hence that it has no significance for him, either pro or contra. He would therefore choose to remain in ignorance of what he had accomplished, in order that his striving might not be retarded by a preoccupation with the external, and lest he fall into the temptation which proceeds from it. He would therefore keep himself in ignorance of his accomplishment by a resolution of will, and even in the hour of death he would not allow himself to know that his life had any other significance than that he had ethically striven to further the development of his own self. And this is a perfect description of SK himself and how he strived to be, excuse me, and it's past my bedtime. He strived to be an ethical, subjective thinker, and avoided this uh, attempt to become world historical. I mean, SK did become world historical, but that was not his objective. He did not put his heart and soul into it. It wasn't the love of his life, like so many people who want to be rich and famous and so forth. Um, and it happened after his life. He was never that wealthy. Well, he was wealthy because of some of the wealth that he inherited from his father, but he spent that and died in poverty ultimately. He spent his fortune really on producing many of his books, and so this is a description of Kierkegaard as the subjective thinker. And SK would someday make Denmark into a noble country, a notable country who could produce such a genius. And it's similar to Socrates. Socrates, who died at the hands of the people of Athens, also helped make Athens into a great notable city in the world. And SK did the same thing with Denmark. To the end of his days, this rejection by Denmark. See, actually, Denmark rejected SK, made fun of him. He was popular for a while, but then the whole country turned against him, especially in the attacks by the Corsair that was a tabloid newspaper similar to what we have in tabloid newspapers today in the Inquirer and the Star. This left Kierkegaard with a deep bitterness that his own country turned against him and never appreciated him. In Lowry's biography of S.K., there are indications that maybe S.K. had overreacted to the reception he received in Denmark. But nevertheless, this little town of Copenhagen, a market town as he called it, through the attacks by the corsair, had seemed to turn against him. He himself knew that his genius and his efforts that he put into his writings would someday be of extreme importance to the world. But the little town of Copenhagen in which he lived during his time paid little or nothing to acknowledge him. So it left him with something of a bitterness in the way he was received in Denmark. And he wanted in his point of view for my work as an author for this to be explained and repeated for future generations. He was a little bit bitter. I mean, I have to admit. I mean, he wasn't able totally to accept his own admonition that the ethical person lives his life without any concern for whether he's received or rejected. So, he's human. As in our study, Pastor Charlstrom at St. Paul said this very thing, and just proves that he's human. He has feelings. And it left him with some bitterness about how he was received in Copenhagen and in Denmark. So we see the human side, we see the ideal side in this work. So to get back to the subject that we're talking about, only in the ethical view of life is there truth and immortality. If, as in the Hegelian system, the understanding of truth is to be found in a study of the historical, then Kierkegaard posits the following question. If one posits only the evolution of the race, the generations of men, how does one explain the divine wastefulness which uses the infinite host of individuals, one generation after the other, merely for the purpose of getting the world historical process going? The world historical is infinitely dilatory. Why does God not hasten, if that's all he wants? What an undramatic exhibition of patience, or rather, what prosaic and tiresome procrastination. And if that is all God wants, how terrible, tyrannical, to waste upon it myriads of human lives. In other words, what's the purpose if it's only a world historical process in the process of becoming? On the other hand, if the task of becoming subjective is given individually, to each human being, then everything is beautifully arranged, and each single individual has the same importance before God. Here it must be added that Kierkegaard does not reject the study of the world historical necessarily. He gives all honor to the historical sciences as well as all science, as long as they are put in their proper perspective. The added advantage of the subjective view of the meaning of life is that it is not based upon intelligence, but rather the passion of inwardness, which all men potentially can possess equally. Here it must be added that we are in this book primarily dealing with the incarnate will, not the majestic and inscrutable hidden will of God, in which God fashions the hearts of all. This subject requires a whole book in itself. And once again, you can look into this in Bondage of the Will by Luther. So then the subjects that the subjective thinker engages in, and now Johannes Climacus goes into the subjects that the subjective thinker thinks about. For example, and he brings up a numerous number of issues. What does it mean to die? For example, this is what the subjective thinker thinks about. I know concerning this what people in general know. I know that I shall die if I take a dose of sulfuric acid, and also if I drown myself or go to sleep in an atmosphere of coal gas and so forth. I know that Napoleon always went about with poison ready to hand, and that Juliet and Shakespeare poisoned herself. I know that the Stoics regarded suicide as a courageous deed, and that others considered it a cowardly act. I know that death may result from so ridiculous and trivial a circumstance that even the most serious minded of men cannot help laughing at death. But in spite of all this knowledge, Johannes Climacus frankly admits that he still has not understood death, or what it means to die. In addition, in order to think about death properly, one must have the idea before him every day at every moment, because each day brings the uncertainty home to him in the passion of subjectivity. The goal of objective thinking, on the other hand, is to lose oneself in the objective contemplation of empirical reality, such as history, for example. It's quite easy to lose one's own subjective self by constant absorption in the empirical, or what is, from the subjective thinker's point of view, the accidental. So here we have again the difference between the subjective and the objective thinker. Another question that he brings up at random, because there's no real uh, reason for all these subjective issues. The other thing he brings up is, what does it mean to be immortal? What does it mean that I, as a Christian, am immortal? In this respect, I know what people generally know. I know that some hold a belief in immortality that others say they do not hold. Whether they actually do not hold it, I know not. It does not occur to me, therefore, to want to combat them, for such an undertaking is so dialectically difficult that I would need a year and a day before it could become dialectically clear to me whether there is any reality in such a contest. The question of immortality is not a learned question to be speculated upon, but by speculative philosophers, as when, for example, immortality is equated with the idea of infinity, and therefore the question seems to have been resolved. The question of immortality is rather a question, once again, of inwardness, that is, of subjectivity. In other words, in the words of Johannes Climacus, am I, Johannes Climacus, immortal? This is the proper way to deal with this question, by stirring up the personal concern of inwardness, which leads to passion, repentance, and faith. The next question that Johannes Climacus brings up is, what does it mean to thank God for the good he bestows on me? And this is an issue I struggle with all the time. A lot of times, God gives me things I don't like, and I wish he would not give them. And I even pray that he gives me something different, and he keeps loading something other than I pray for on me. So it's something personal that I can relate to, and I think almost everybody can. What does it mean to thank God for the good He bestows on me? This says the parson. We ought to do, and if we merely discharge this obligation, then he who is not disposed to be satisfied with the humble tasks in life which engage the simple man will have time to employ himself with world history. So I am bound to thank God, says the parson, and for what? For good. For the good he bestows upon me. But for what good? Why, surely for that good which I perceive is the good. Halt. If I thank God for the good which I know is good, I make a fool of God. For instead of my relationship to God signifying that I am reformed into his likeness, I form God into my likeness. I thank him for the good which I know is good, but what I know is the finite, and so I proceed to thank God for the fact that he has humored my whim. So we should thank God for whatever he brings upon us as Christians, and that's not so easy. I personally struggle with this, as many Christians do, and what God brings into my life, and it's not always so pleasant, but I have to realize that it's God's wish and God's will in a way that I cannot understand. Another issue of the subjective thinker is this: what does it mean to get married? About this, I know what people generally know. I have access to the garden where the erotic authors pluck flowers for their bouquets. Mine shall be as fragrant as most of them. I know where the storehouse is whence the parsons fetch their discourses. If there is nothing else to hinder one from becoming a universal historian, well then, let us now begin. But after all, what is the meaning which marriage expresses between the mimetic and the psychosomatic? How is it that spiritually understood it is a blessing? For to say what the erotic is answers in fact only one part of the question. How is it that the ethical becomes a task at the same time that the erotic expects the miracle? And here we're touching on the issue that we already looked at in Either War, Volume 1, and also Stages on Life's Way in the dialogues in the banquet on how to uh, reconcile the erotic with the idea of the institution of marriage. So I won't get into that further at this point. So these are just a few of the questions that Johannes Climacus deals with in the Subjective Thinker. And actually, we could go on for days, weeks, months on all these different issues. And SK did, in fact. And one of the books he wrote, or one of his extant writings, are his journals. And this is just one. This is one of about, I think this is one of 4 of SK's journals and papers on how he philosophized. He contemplated all the issues of the subjective thinker. So there's one heck of an enormous amount of study we can do on the subjective thinker. Well, we've got about 5.5 minutes to go. So that pretty much covers this chapter 6, and now chapter 7 will be the next chapter. And in this part, we're going to go into the chapter 7, the second book of the concluding unscientific postscript, which goes into the epistemological issues of SK's subjective philosophy. And it's not really an issue that I can start right now, because we go very deeply into epistemology, metaphysics, philosophy, phenomenology, whatever you want to call it. All those things pretty much interact with each other in this whole analysis in chapter 7. But let's just look a little bit more at what we're going to go into after that. Once we get through the epistemology of SK's thinking, the real heart and soul of this book, then we're going to get into the ethical sphere of existence. Now, the ethical sphere of existence is a transitional phase between the aesthetic and the religious. So far, everything we've been looking at is in the aesthetic sphere, which is the widest, the most expansive sphere of existence for SK. The ethical sphere is analyzed in Either Or, Volume 2, and in Stages on Life's Way, and Judge William Affam's analysis of marriage, the erotic and also of marriage, and how to preserve a happy marriage, both erotically and ethically. So that will be the ethical sphere for the most part. And then we go on to the religious sphere. And in the religious sphere, we're going to analyze two stages of religion, which SK called religiousness A and religiousness B. Then we go on into, when we get into religiousness B, which is based on the teleological suspension of the ethical in fear and trembling, and then we get into the truly Christian sphere of existence, and how Frater Taciturnus comes into the sphere of existence in Stages on Life's Way. I've got a minute to go. And then we get into the psychological works, repetition, concept of dread. And concept of dread is going to be a really extremely interesting study. It's one of the top 3 books, in my opinion, that SK ever wrote. It's a work of real pure genius. So we go into that, and then we'll go into sickness unto death, which is really an analysis of what depression is all about. And the interesting thing is how modern medicine has largely misunderstood the nature of depression. And now we get into the sickness unto death. And then finally we get into, the dialectical analysis of Christianity in terms of religious pathos and dialectics. And then we get into his attack upon Christendom, and then we're done. It'll take about 30 more studies or so, but we'll get through it. My time is 5 seconds to go. So that's it, and I'll see you tomorrow, God willing. Bye.